Hello, thank you for joining me today. My name is Colin Hamilton, and today I will be talking to you about fantasy football focused media and its relationship with traditional NFL media. However, first I have to give you some background information on the NFL and fantasy football in their own regard. The NFL has been a popular sport over the last 30 to 40 years, according to Darren Rovell, an ESPN insider who took in different surveys to find the most popular sports in America. In 2013, its most popular year, according to TV by the Numbers, in terms of viewership and TV ratings, there were 20.3 million viewers averaged per primetime game on major cable networks. That's 190% higher than any other show that was aired in primetime on those same cable networks, which would include NBC, CBS, Fox, etc. Fantasy football has been around since the 1960s. It was used for journalists to talk more in depth about teams and individual players and get people more interested in different aspects of the game. In 2008, there were 18 million players. This was right before the explosion of smartphones, tablets, etc. And now, today, with more access means more people can play, and there were 54.7 million players in 2016, according to Fantasy Sports Demographics, which takes in all the demographics from ESPN and Yahoo Fantasy Sports apps, which were the two most popular over the last 3 years. Now, since I have questions about how fantasy football focused media affects traditional NFL media, I had to look at different theories and see how those were affected. The first is attitudinal loyalty. That is consumer loyalty to a product, which in this case would be the NFL or an individual team in the NFL. And a study in 2011 called Divided Loyalty with a question mark, an analysis of fantasy football and fan loyalty to NFL teams, found that the most important thing to participants in fantasy football was that their professional team that they rooted for was successful at the end of the day, more so than anything else. The second is a form of technological determinism, which is a Marxist idea that was developed in the 1800s, where technology determines what and how people interact with the world around them. And the form of this is called media determinism. And a theory was developed by Marshall McLuhan. And it can be simply stated as the medium is the message. And what he means by that is a medium embeds itself into a message, which symbiotic relationships are created and where the medium influences how the message is perceived. Using these, I developed a research question where I basically said, how has fantasy football focused media changed the way people consume traditional NFL media? And what I mean by traditional NFL media is television shows where they don't talk about fantasy football and it's just information about teams and players or the games themselves even. So the way I went about this was to develop a survey because I had to find a way to get a lot of respondents because there are 54.7 million participants in the last year, so I had to find a way to get quite a few responses so I could develop a clean conclusion and results. So I did completely closed-ended questions, and I capped the respondents at 150, so because I felt that 150 and 200 wasn't going to make much of a difference. And I only used one demographic question, which was age, because I wasn't sure if I'd really get that much of a difference in terms of gender and race. And the majority of the people were between the age range of 18 to 35. And so what I did was a snowball sample where I emailed my survey to friends who I knew played in fantasy sports leagues and had them email it to coworkers and other friends that I may not know, or post it to social media. And since this was a blind survey in terms of who was responding, they didn't have to leave their name or anything. I wouldn't know who was responding and how they were responding. So some of the interesting results that I found were that 122 people were considered themselves average to very loyal NFL fans and consumers, where after they started playing fantasy football, 142 of the 150 said that they were average to dedicated NFL consumers, which is almost 100% of the people that responded. Before fantasy football, the majority of the people, 108 to be exact, used 2 or less devices to consume NFL media. And after they started playing fantasy football, 110 people said they used 3 or more, and 14 said they used 5 or more devices. And what I mean by devices are radio, television, tablet, phone, etc. And the way they access that influences what they have access to. And 54 said that after they played fantasy football, that they used 5 or more sources to gain information about their fantasy football teams and players, where 108 never or rarely did this before playing fantasy football. In terms of fan loyalty to a team, 128 said winning was all that mattered for that team on Sundays before they played fantasy football, whereas only 52 respondents responded the same way after they started playing fantasy football. That's a fairly big change. And another thing I wanted to look at was, because they are getting more information, they may feel more involved and have more in-depth knowledge. So I wanted to look at gambling and its role in fantasy football and traditional NFL media. So 100 people said that they weren't willing to gamble on a regular season game or a whole season before they played fantasy football. However, 110 do now after they started playing. So that's a dramatic change. Almost, it went from 2/3 being against to 2/3 being for gambling. And then looking at individual players on those teams, over half the people, 76, didn't root for players on other teams than on their favorite professional team before they played fantasy football. However, 144 of those respondents say they do now, and 130 will root for a player on a team they want to lose, whereas 31 respondents only said that they would do the same thing before playing fantasy football. So, in conclusion, what I found was that parts of traditional NFL media has been affected by fantasy football focused media, such as the way the data suggests that people are using more devices now to access both traditional and fantasy football focused media. And that's a way for people to feel more involved. And I found that the attitudinal loyalty didn't really reflect what the 2011 study, the divided loyalty piece, said in terms of the team success of the actual professional team was all that really mattered. I found that people had a more attitudinal loyalty and consumer loyalty to the NFL as a whole, because they're paying attention to more players, more teams, and consuming just a lot more information about the league itself. And that may affect how much they're focused on the team they want to root for in terms of game to game without thinking about fantasy football. I also found that the media itself is affecting how people are perceiving it, because they want to have you look more in depth at the league. They want you to be more involved, and the larger loyalty to the NFL is affected by the smaller portion of fantasy football participants. However, one thing I thought would happen that didn't happen was that they would watch for more sensational plays and only be looking for the plays that help their fantasy football team succeed in a game-to-game basis, as opposed to watching the game and just enjoying it for what it is as entertainment. However, before and after, it didn't change at all, which was really surprising to me, because if they're changing how they're consuming everything and how they're rooting for teams and players, it would be easily acceptable to only watch for those things as well, because it's affecting how well you do in your fantasy sports league. Some of the limitations I had in my study were that it doesn't include when people started participating and how much technology is increased and how many things people have access to the internet with now. And so that may slightly change some of the answers or conclusions that I determined, but I did find that a lot of the trends went the same way, and in very similar questions, if they had a similar structure and in terms of the before and after. I found that only having me as the coder and only doing close-ended questions was easier to do, but maybe I should have included a few open-ended questions so I could get more of what people were actually thinking and could understand a more in-depth way that they were thinking. But ultimately, I found that in some ways, fantasy football focused media has affected how traditional NFL media is consumed, but not in all the ways I was anticipating. Thank you very much for listening to me today. Have a good evening.